Everyone, I'm Elena Novelli. I'm Professor of Strategy at the Business School of City University of London and the Chair of the Knowledge and Innovation Interest Group of the Strategic Management Society. Today, together with Tobias Kretschmer and Giovanni Valentini, the Program and Associate Chair of KNI, we would like to welcome you to the Knowledge and Innovation Virtual Series. The reason why we decided to launch this series is that, very unfortunate this year, due to the pandemic, the SMS community will not have the chance to meet in person in London, which is something we were really looking forward to. However, the situation has given us the chance to reflect on the potential of virtual meetings as an opportunity to get together, to bring together our community throughout the year, and not only during the annual conference. So we have decided to launch the Knowledge and Innovation Virtual Series, which is a series of events that will showcase a conversation with thought leaders in the field of knowledge and innovation. So we have decided to start the series with a reflection on a topic that is very close to the knowledge and innovation community, which is the role of knowledge as a strategic resource, crucial in determining a firm's sustained performance and competitive advantage. So in the last few years, what we have seen is an incredible upsurge in the performance and scope of applicability of artificial intelligence algorithms, which are essentially algorithms that systematically convert data into predictions and that can be used to guide firms' action. Now, traditionally, individuals within firms are entrusted with this very same task. So, in a world in which artificial intelligence becomes better, faster, and cheaper, a very relevant question is really, what is the role left to human knowledge within firms, and what type of knowledge becomes strategic in a world in which artificial intelligence is prevalent? So we are very fortunate to have three exceptional speakers today that have kindly accepted the Knowledge and Innovation community invitation to join us and discuss about this today. So these are really three guests that need no introduction, but I would like to start by introducing them. So our first speaker today will be Professor Avi Goldfarb. Professor Goldfarb is the Rothman Chair in Artificial Intelligence and Healthcare and Professor of Marketing at Rothman. He is also Chief Data Scientist at the Creative Destruction Lab and Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research in the economics of technology has influenced both the academic and policy debate. Along with AJ Agarwal and Joshua Gans, Avi is the author of the Globe and Mail best-selling book, Prediction Machines, The Simple Economics of Artificial Intelligence. Our second speaker today will be Professor Carliss Baldwin. Professor Baldwin is the William White Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. She studies the process of design and the impact of design architecture on firm strategy, platform, and business ecosystems. With King Clark, she authored Design Rules, Volume 1, The Power of Modularity. She has won numerous awards for research, including being named in 2015 the Distinguished Scholar of the Technology and Innovation Management Division of the Academy of Management. And last but not least, Professor Gautam Ahuja. Professor Ahuja is a Professor of Management and Organizations at the Samuel Curtis Johnson Graduate School of Management at Cornell University. His research focuses on competitive analysis, technology and innovation, and the use of interorganizational arrangements in these contexts. His research on these issues has received several global awards, including the Team Distinguished Scholar Award in 2019. He was also celebrated as a foundation scholar by the Knowledge and Innovation Interest Group of the Strategic Management Society for his contributions in the field of strategy and innovation. So we will start with 10 minutes opening remarks from the three speakers, and then we will open it for questions from the audience. Please type in your questions in the Q&A sections, and please feel free to type in your questions as the speaker give their opening remarks, and we will go back to those questions after the speakers have completed their opening remarks. But before hearing from the speakers, we would really like to know what the knowledge and innovation community thinks about the topic of today's session. So I would like to ask Robin to please launch a little poll that we have prepared for you. Yes, so here is the poll. So as you can see, the question where we would like your input is, in the age of artificial intelligence, will human intelligence become irrelevant for firms? And the answers are never. Artificial intelligence will at most be a powerful complement, or not within our lifetime, or yes, it will eventually become make human intelligence irrelevant, but only in 10, 20 years from now. Or yes, human intelligence will become irrelevant in the next 5 years. So we'll wait for a few seconds that participants have the chance to enter their answers. So Robin, when please, yes, okay, so here are the results. The greatest majority thinks that artificial intelligence will at most be a powerful complement, but it will never make human intelligence become irrelevant for firms. And the other answer seems to go in the same direction, because the second most frequent answer is it will happen, but not within our lifetime. So this is what the knowledge and innovation community thinks about this question. But on this note, we would really like to know what our panelists think about this. So I would like to let Avi share his thoughts on this topic. Avi, if you're ready. I think you're muted. Perhaps I can.
For coming, for inviting me. It's great to see some familiar names on the list, and some new names, some people who I haven't met, and maybe someday we'll get to meet in person. For today, you know, the topic is AI, organizational power and organizational knowledge, and the thing I want to talk about is, let's start with this story. I don't know if you guys remember this story. Amazon automatically tracks and fires warehouse workers for productivity. Came out about a year ago, and it was extremely controversial. The idea was there was a machine learning algorithm that was determining the productivity of warehouse workers, and they got fired based on what the machine, what the machine predicted their productivity to be, and some machine assessment of whether they did well enough. I think this story missed a lot. And in particular, nobody ever lost a job to a robot. I think it's really important to recognize. They didn't lose their job to a robot. They lost their job because someone decided to program a robot. That's the way to think about this change. When we think about algorithmic decision-making, it's not an algorithm making a decision. It's a human program making a decision to create a threshold and a model that then affects things at scale going into the future. So the problem with algorithmic decisions isn't that there's a machine making a decision, it's that there's some obfuscation about who's really at fault if something goes wrong. To unpack these ideas and some others, this is the general theme of my book with Jay Agarwal and Joshua Gans, Prediction Machines. And the key point, and this actually relates very directly to the poll, is that there's a lot of confusion when we're talking about AI. So when we talk about AI, lots of people think we're talking about an artificial general intelligence. Whether it's an optimistic one like C3PO, that's a robot that can do just about everything humans do. C3PO does two things better than human. First, C3PO can translate, that's sort of part of the movie. And second, C3PO listens to humans. And so that makes C3PO an optimistic version of robots that we see, of artificial intelligence that we see in science fiction. And the rest of science fiction, of course, is filled with these machines that can do everything we can do, but don't listen to us. And that's where we get the pessimistic view. And when I looked at that poll, there were at least 2 of you who seemed to be saying, this is imminent. We're going to have machines that can do everything we can do within 5 years. Maybe we are, maybe we aren't. To be clear, I don't think that artificial general intelligence, that kind of, an AI that can do everything humans can do, is impossible. Frankly, I used to think it was, and then I witnessed a debate between Daniel Kahneman and Jan LeCun that convinced me a few years ago at a conference we hosted in Toronto, that convinced me this isn't impossible. But it's very important to recognize this is not what we're talking about today. The reason we're talking about AI in 2020, and we weren't talking about it in 2010 to the same degree, and certainly not in 2000, has nothing to do with an AGI, artificial general intelligence. It's because machine learning, which is a branch of computational statistics, has gotten much better. What's machine learning? Machine learning is prediction technology. It takes information you have and it generates information you don't have. That's it. So what's happened is prediction technology has gotten much better. And in 10 minutes, I can't go into all the details about that, but in the book, we detail the consequences of how better, faster, cheaper prediction can still be transformative and is still transformative, even if it's not general intelligence. Now, the last question is what's left for humans. And so, well, if machines are getting better and better and better at prediction, then the aspects of your human job that are prediction are increasingly going to be done by machine. And what does that leave? That leaves data and the ability to take action. What is perhaps most interesting and most human and most important for organizations is what we call judgment. So to unpack judgment, I'm going to go to another science fiction example, and then I'm going to wrap up with how to think about this in the organizational context. So this movie, I, Robot. I don't know if you've seen the movie. It's a fine movie with this fantastic scene. So Will Smith is the protagonist in I, Robot, and he hates robots. So that's sort of, you can see where the movie's going to go. And there's this scene in I, Robot where it's the flashback scene, why he hates robots. And Will Smith and this little girl are driving, and they get into an accident, and they start sinking into a river, and it's pretty clear that both Will Smith and this girl are going to drown. Then a robot comes along and saves Will Smith and not the girl. And that's why he hates robots. He says the robot should have saved the girl and not me. What's interesting is because it's a robot, he can audit the decision. So he can go back and figure out, why did the robot save him and not the girl? What he finds out is the robot predicted that he had a 45% chance of survival. And that girl only had an 11% chance. And that's why the robot saved him and not the girl. And then Will Smith goes on to say 11% was more than enough, and a human being would have known that. Maybe, maybe not. The 11% versus 45%, that's a prediction. Who to save, that's judgment. What he's saying, if the robot should have saved the girl and not him, that girl's life is worth more than 4 times his life. He's saying something very particular about about values and about payoffs. And so in order to use predictions well, we need to know and specify payoffs. And that's where I think organizational knowledge comes in. You need to know the objectives of your organization. You need to know the values of your organization. And you need to be able to translate the objectives and values into measurable KPIs. That's the essence of the skills around prediction technology that lead to organizations. And it is about embedding a high-level organizational culture to generate those objectives and values. That's what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Avi. Very interesting point. So we would like to hear Carli's perspective on this issue. And before this, I would like just to remind you, attendees, that you can ask your questions in the Q&A sections. And perhaps you can also indicate who you would like to be the first respondents to those questions. Carliss, if you're ready, over to you.
Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So thank you. I want to thank Elena, Toby, and Giovanni for organizing this wonderful workshop. All the participants, saw many names I know. Welcome, and say how honored I am to be sharing this session with Avi and Gautam, and very pleased to be here. My topic is knowledge complementarities, and let me just dive in. This is the question that we were given by the organizers, and I am told to answer this question in 10 minutes or less. Avi did a fabulous job, but he wrote a whole book about it. I will go fast. My slides are available on request. So here we go. Today I'm going to apply the theory of complementarity to knowledge in digital exchange platforms. And I'm so glad Avi talked about machine learning, and because these guys are at the heart of it. They are the ones we fear. I call them digital exchange platforms because there are many kinds of platforms out there. They are transaction platforms where goods and property rights are traded for money. Examples, Alibaba, eBay, Amazon, stock exchanges. And communication platforms where messages are sent and received, and they're often ad-supported. Google search, social media, all social media. Zoom, which we're on right now, is a communication platform. And you get pretty much, well, digital, as Avi has told us, automated processes based on algorithms, a product of the information age. Definitions: complementarity, strong complements. This is from Hart and Moore, 1990. Both A and B are needed to create any value, each worthless with it. So example, your right shoe and left shoe, if they happen to become separated and one was lost, the other wouldn't be worth very much, at least you wouldn't be able to walk very well. Supermodular, but not strong complementarity. This comes from Milgram and Roberts, same year. A and B each have separate value greater than 0, but A makes B more valuable and vice versa. And so if you have a sweater and pants and they match one another really well, they each have separate value, but they have somewhat more, maybe a lot more value if you can combine them. So the theory here, strong complements should be created and owned by a single firm. And for strategy, what that means is that internal capabilities, the firm will need internal capabilities to generate all parts that are complementary, and it should restrict access to that knowledge. The proposition is due to Hart and Moore. The translation into strategy is self-evident. Supermodular but not strong complements may be created and owned by a diverse cluster of autonomous agents, an ecosystem. This was a point made by Michael Jacobides, Carmela Sonamo, and Annabelle Gaver in a paper published in 2018. Okay, so all set. We've got all the building blocks. Here we go. The core processes, and this gets to what Avi was telling us, of a digital exchange platform are a set of algorithms. First, they're algorithms that do search and ad placement. You land on the page, and one way or the other, you're going to trigger a search function and an ad placement function. Second, all of these platforms do dynamic pricing of goods in a transaction platform and dynamic pricing of ads in a communication platform. And third, and here's exactly building on Avi, data analysis and prediction. They collect data, a lot of it, and in real time, they make predictions so that in the milliseconds between clicks and page loads and the machinery in the background, the servers and the algorithms are accessing data, processing it, and generating those predictions that Avi described. And they do it at speed and at scale that is just phenomenal. All these processes must be very fast and synchronized. They have to work within a very small time window of milliseconds. And bottlenecks can arise anywhere. You want to know what humans do? They address bottlenecks. Machines do too, but humans program the machines too. So your site is slow. What do? What's resources being constrained? Because it's always a bottleneck. Is it CPU bound? Is it disk bound? This is from a Google engineer quoted in 2011. This all doesn't happen at once by itself, and it doesn't stay on track. So all the parts are needed. Any part can slow down the rest. So these are strong complements. That's what the dark arrows mean. And just throwing out the question, what if you buy one piece from someone else? One piece of this essential triad. Well, how many ways can you say, hold up? Google AdSense is a case in point. Just be prepared to pay, because what you're buying is essential to what you do, and the seller can take a big chunk of your profit if you get tied up too closely. So now, I can't do justice to Avi, but let's unpack data analysis and prediction just a little bit. Here we've got machine learning and AI. I lump them together. I actually think the ML part these days is more important than the AI part, but they're both going on, and they're both very useful. The other thing that we often forget is the experiments that get run. The controlled experiments, the A/B experiments, where you have two products or two pages that you're trying to decide what to prioritize in your predictions, and you run a controlled experiment, under close design principles, and those happen all the time too, within the same time frame as those core processes, although the experiments are not actually part of the core. So this knowledge, in contrast to the strong complementary algorithms, this knowledge is fragmented, diffuse, it's all over the place, it's being developed on many different separate lines. It is the opposite of tightly integrated and synchronized code. Yet progress in machine learning and AI allows better controlled experiments and vice versa. What do you experiment on but predictions? So these are super modular but not strong complements. And both can be used to improve data prediction and analysis algorithms. That's why you do them. That's the research end of the platform function, is to find out which new pieces can be added to data prediction and analysis, and also to search and ad placement and dynamic pricing that will make the whole thing better at doing what it does. And it violates our privacy all over the place, but there are studies, a few, that show that people react very badly to prediction algorithms that aren't very good and don't use their private data. So these are strong complements at the top, super modular, but not strong complements at the bottom. Both types of knowledge are strategic, but a strategy is going to be different. Here, you want to insource as much as you can and protect your IP. These will be the crown jewels of your platform company. And here you want to leverage the ecosystem. You want to invest in absorptive capacity, alliances, and open innovation. So that's the principle. That's the general theory. It generalizes. In fact, you can apply it to the strong and super modular complements you see in the firms you study. The question is, where do you draw the line between the two parts? And since I'm out of time, I will leave that as an exercise to the listeners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carliss. And before we move to hearing Gautam's perspective, I would like to remind participants about the fact that when we will get to the Q&A session, we will ask them to unmute themselves and ask the questions themselves. So please write the questions in the Q&A sections, but we will then ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question to the panelists. So Gautam, whenever you're ready, I still see Carliss' presentation on the screen.
I'm going to leave.
So we see your presentation, Gautam, if you want to put it in. Yes,
Sure.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. And I think this was amazing that the sequence worked out so beautifully in the sense that both Carliss and Avi kind of did my job for me. And I'm just going to tie up tie together the sort of things in a certain way. Core idea, I'm going to begin with, given that we have very little time, I'm going to begin with the big picture takeaway here, which is simply that the question that we were asked as the poll still focused on the limitations or capabilities of individual humans, right? So will machine intelligence overtake or artificial intelligence overtake humans? And the key construct that was omitted in a sense was the role of the organization. And the organization has always been a device built by humans to essentially overcome the limitations and enhance the opportunity, usage of opportunities. And that's the kind of theme that I'm going to build on, is that, in fact, I'm going to argue that there's a bunch of complements associated with artificial intelligence, and managing that system of complements is something that an organization can do very well or very badly. And we have enough information both on the AI side and on the organization design and management side to be able to connect these parts. Okay, so let me begin with a very simple typology from Yao Jia in Zhao's work, where they've basically taken the prediction idea, but what they do is they say, like, what are the different ways that these systems can be combined or can deliver? So you have systems that act as simple as the fire alarm or the thermostat, systems that predict, and so on and so forth. I won't walk through all of them, but the general idea is this is a hierarchical typology. So the next level usually implies subsuming the previous level and then moving beyond it, okay? And what it does for us is that if you look at the hierarchy, the way it's set up, level 7 is what Avi was referring to as the artificial general intelligence, and that would be sort of level 6 and 7 would be at that there, but we're not there on 7 for sure, because that would essentially require you to be even better than humans, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the first few, it's telling us that if we want to use those pieces of, or those types of systems, there's a certain set of organizational requirements. So to begin with, there's data volume. But if you want to go to systems that predict, you need just not data volume, but also scope, in the sense that you probably need different types of data, not just more data of the same kind. So to be able to make a prediction, you could make a prediction out of one kind of data and a very long, sort of a huge sample of it. But then as you go higher up the system, the scope of the knowledge or the information required also broadens. So if you go from the first to the second, you have data volume and scope, then so on. And if you go to number 4, where you're talking about computational creativity, you actually have data recombination, which means data volume and scope, and also data reduction, the ability to bring together those combinations that are meaningful. Otherwise, you have a combinatorial explosion and so on. And finally, then you go on to the next 2 stages, which are systems that relate. One illustration of that is sentiment analysis, which requires a wide variety of data and large volume of data, the ability to reduce the data into cognitive categories and then sort of make sense of those cognitive categories. And that's where you sort of start entering the realm of things that prediction alone cannot do. That's where you need the organizational judgment coming in. I mean, to some extent it's required in all of these, so this distinction is artificial, but I wanted to point out that there are variations along different functional uses of AI, which increase or decrease the need for organizational judgment, which is the core construct that I'm going to focus on. So what I'm going to do is this slide is an attempt at providing the various ways that you can functionally benefit from AI as an organization in the business world. Slide 1. Slide 2 is saying, okay, what are the challenges? So if the slide 1 is the opportunities, slide 2 is the challenges. And what we're going to do is follow a very simple kind of logical process of saying, how do we maximize the opportunity, benefit from the opportunities and minimize the challenges or the problems? And in that, basically, what is the role of organizational judgment? And therefore, how do you build organizational judgment in a world of artificial intelligence? So that's the core idea, okay? So what are some of the challenges? We all know these well. I'm not going to spend too much of time on it. And like Carliss, my slides will be available to anybody that requires them. You have problems of poor sampling, that the sample from which you train the algorithm is actually systematically biased in some fashion. You may have inaccurate data. Data were not accurately entered, and so on and so forth. You may have biased data because there is something underlying, for instance, if you have medical data, very often medical data consists of people that have been sampled in different ways. So it's kind of connected to the poor sampling, but not necessarily. You can have data biases without necessarily sampling being the observer. Then finally, you have the problem of unmeasurable data, simply things that are not open to measurement. Then you have inadequate data. You just don't have enough to make a good prediction. And then you have inadequate data in terms of scope, is that the best prediction requires multiple pieces of data and large volumes of it, of each type, but you just don't have it, right? Once you recognize the set of problems, you can see that there is a bunch of organizational solutions that are possible. You pick, for sampling, you might decide to pick multiple samples. You decide to deepen the scope of your, basically of your search to uncover data and so on and so forth. If it's inaccurate data, you want to make sure you're improving your validation capabilities. With biased data, you want to make sure that you have a review basis of data and past decisions to make sure that you're picking up on these biases, etc. For unmeasurable data, very often you will have to resolve or sort of fall back on individual or collective judgment or estimation of some kind. For inadequate data, you would either increase organizational scale or organizational scope, right? So now the question is, these are all the sort of desiderata with respect to knowledge in an organization. So let's actually go to what is this whole thing sort of coming together. So I call this the intelligent organization pentagon, largely because there are 5 things that are important. You begin with data, you add algorithms. At the sort of pinnacle is the construct of organizational judgment, which I'm going to focus on, and that's the real core of the paper. Then you have execution of those decisions, and then you have feedback, and that sort of goes back into the data loop and so on, right? And the first thing to recognize is that all 5 of these are complements to each other, in the sense that if you have mismatches between these, they can lead to garbage in, garbage out, or worse. I'm not, in the interest of time, going to go into the other 4 boxes, but I will spend time on the organizational judgment one here, okay? So what are ways that you can actually, So what is judgment, let's begin with, and then let's say what is organizational judgment. So judgment, I'm going to use a very simplified version of it, which is the ability to use sparse data to construct abstractions to facilitate decision-making, okay? This is the individual equivalence of our concept of judgment. But at the organizational level, we have something which kind of builds upon this. We say it's the assemblage of organizational capabilities that transform individual judgment and capabilities into organizational decisions and capabilities, and should ideally enable organizational decision-making to be superior to the decision-making capabilities of any individual in the organization. So no matter how good an individual is, the underlying sort of presumption here is that a well-designed organization can overcome that. And we've seen what are the parameters of the design of that organization, which came up from these 2 slides. Basically, I don't have enough time to get into them, but the idea is how do you increase volume, scope, etc., and then how do you improve sampling, data accuracies, etc. So those give us the core idea. And once we recognize that eventually we have a bunch of 5 levers that we can pull to address these opportunities and challenges. And in the context of AI, we basically can use the standard levers of organization design, which is strategy, structure, membership, systems and processes, and culture, the 5 components that we've had for a lot of other things. And that now allows us to essentially enhance organizational judgment, which is kind of the most important complement to this set of, to the AI processes that we've talked about. And so I've put down very quickly, because don't have enough, obviously time, what would be some generic strategies for improving organizational judgment in an AI world. And the core thing to remember is that there needs to be a discriminating fit between the chosen strategies and the strategic goals on the one hand, and between the chosen strategies themselves. So now you can see that the first component is, if you really want to build a competitive advantage through AI, you have to consider the scale and scope of the organization very closely, because, and that kind of, the scope part has been very nicely outlined by, Carliss's presentation earlier. The scale was sort of, in a sense, is very much a part of the prediction concept that Avi had brought up earlier. The second part is organizational structure. We now actually have a very good understanding of different types of organizational structures and what they do to decision making, which are good at doing one kind of thing versus another. I just picked one simple index here, which is the polyarchy hierarchy spectrum. But there are multiple other design criteria also that have been researched in the context of the very specific problems that I outlined earlier. Just to give you a sense of how the logic flows in the bigger picture, in where polyarchy and hierarchy is just this thing. The point is, if you want more exploration, polyarchy makes sense. If you want more execution or more rigid execution, hierarchy makes sense. If I go back to Avi's illustration of the algorithmic control system, either in Uber or in Amazon, the point is, this is exactly the question that's being addressed by this, is that depending upon the nature of a particular task that's being aided by artificial intelligence, may want to choose within an organization a polyarchical or a hierarchical mode, because one permits more exploration, the other permits more execution in certain ways. And so there has to be that sort of discriminating fit between individual task needs and this. Okay? That also brings us to systems that we might need to improve, and all of those come from the earlier slides as well. A very important component is the members. And there I wanted to talk about what I call, just like you have emotional quotient and IQ, you can think of an artificial IQ or artificial intelligence quotient. And what you're really talking about, an intelligence or an organization-wide AIQ intelligence, which requires both hiring people of a certain kind, but also training people in a certain way. And very importantly, you need a culture which kind of recognizes both the slide one and the slide two. So there's the passion and people really passionately proselytizing about it, and then you have the skepticism. And so if you put this together, this is a very, very sort of simple layout of the thing, but it turns out that established organization design helps us do a lot of these things very nicely. I'll stop here. Okay.
Thank you very much, Gautam. And so very, very interesting thoughts. We have gone from discussing about the activities that will be strategic, the organizational structure that is likely to emerge, the boundaries of firms. So before we open to Q&As, are there any reactions among the panelists on each other's presentations?
Sure. I thought that was fascinating. So, my first reaction is I really enjoyed listening to Gautam and Carliss. Carliss, just digging into, so thinking about AI as one component of a digital strategy. Is that how you're thinking about it? You had the three, AI is one component of digital strategy, and they are strong complements. Is that, I interpreted it?
Well, so data, what you talked about, data analysis and prediction is the strong complement of the other algorithms. The science of AI, the field of AI, the field of machine learning, that's a big field and very diffuse. And you really don't want to cut off your organization from access to all the threads that are going on. You want to be using, all the capabilities of boundary spanning, absorptive capacity, tracking, monitoring, alliances, the whole schmear. Because not even the biggest of the big tech companies can track what's going on in machine learning, AI, or experimentation. Those are three very big and very active knowledge building fields. I thought I also found the talks absolutely fascinating, and Gautam, I'm still absorbing what you had to say, because it was very very cogent, and just wondering about what happens when competitive advantage and human values come into conflict, as they so often do in these organizations.
Yeah.
You're muted.
Sorry, yeah. Absolutely. In fact, that's the part where the culture story that I was telling, the last of those 5 bullets, I kind of, to shorten it to make sure that it comes in a 10-minute thing, I talked about passion and skepticism. But the clear idea there was, we need to know who is in command, and who is in command, going back to Avi's story, should be the human who's making this judgment call on whose life is more important than who else's. And that's really a part of the culture. And I don't think the word skepticism captured it. It was an attempt to take one word to capture that entire set of ideas, which I had, compressed into this thing. But I'm with you completely, is that this is something that you want to be very, very careful about, because amongst other things, let's not forget, this is intended to advance the human condition. We're not pursuing it for the purpose of itself, of doing that. And if you recognize the degree of disorientation and alienation that occurs even in moderately large organizations, where the locus of decisions and the impact of decisions at the personal level is different, you can just imagine how that problem gets worsened in the context of AI. And Avi very beautifully brought that out, but you can relate to that, very, very, very clearly, is that we really need that human sort of interaction. And that's not just because we are social sort of beings, which this pandemic is clearly bringing out very clearly that we are, but also because our control over each other is often based on social interaction. And unless you have that as a healthy part of a culture, if you let the AI, sort of passionate folks get away with it, you're going to have very, very dangerous organizational consequences and human consequences thereafter.
I have a story about Amazon from yesterday, but I will refrain from. I wanted to ask Avi if you could talk to us and to the audience about the role of personal data tracking in the prediction models and how it's used. I think that's something that we would all benefit from hearing from you.
Sure. So machine learning models are built on data. We're calling this AI. It's really computational stats. And so that means data makes these models better. And so that creates a tension generally between privacy and innovation. It's not, in principle, you can have so little privacy that people don't give up their data. And so the tension isn't, there's a bit of an inverted U there, but generally, empirically, we've seen a tension between privacy and innovation. The more privacy we have, the less we are able to use data to build predictions, which means the less innovation we have. There's a similar tension between privacy and competition, because privacy rules rarely say, it's hard to restrict what one company can do with the data that sits in the company. And so often when we have privacy laws, it enables the dominant players to get bigger. And Toby has some interesting work on that topic. So So first is there's a tension between privacy and innovation, and the real reason is because data is the core driver of all these algorithms. And I could go on for another hour, but I'll just leave it at that.
Excellent. Thank you. I would like now to give the attendees a chance to ask some questions. And the first question comes from Russ. Giovanni, if you can unmute Russ, he can ask his question. Russ?
Greetings. First of all, thank you. This is wonderful panel and a nice opportunity for us to all consider some really important questions. I have more questions, but I'll hold back because let's let other people in. But Avi, I was, all of you talked about sort of what are the bounds on artificial intelligence and where does human judgment need to come in? And Avi, you brought up this interesting question about values, and in our sort of current situation, it seems obvious that humans are not necessarily all that great when it comes to values either necessarily. And so that got me thinking about, well, you might want to write a program to reflect values as well that might actually ultimately do better than maybe the average human being. But then there has to be then you're up another level and you need a process for, well, how do you write a program for that? Who do you involve? What does it happen? And maybe there's no good answer to that, but I don't know. It struck me as interesting lines of questions.
Absolutely. So I'll go first on that one. The machine is only as good in terms of values as the programmer, as the decisions that went into the reward function given to the machine. So if you don't think other humans have good values, then you won't think the machine has good values. If you like the values and are, of the human who decided what the machine should optimize on, quite likely you'll like the values of the machine. There's an optimistic aspect of machines that's different from human, and that's that machines can be audited. And so you can, after a machine has generated a prediction that led to a sort of an algorithmic decision, you can back out why that happened in a way that you can't if you're auditing a human mind. So in general, to the extent that we agree on values as a society, you would expect machines to become closer and closer and closer to the agreed values because we can audit them and continually improve them in a way that's hard to do with the human mind. So that's the optimistic view. The issue with that is the machines operate at scale. And so one super biased human mind can only do so much damage. One slightly biased machine can do a lot of damage because the people who that machine is biased against could end up facing discrimination everywhere in the world at scale. And so the issue with biased machine is a little bit subtle relative to human bias, which is that it's probably going to be less biased, but it could do a lot more damage to those people it's biased against. Great question.
Excellent, and it's it's fascinating how it seems that across all your talks, the conversation is really going towards values and towards how it seems to be the case that in the artificial intelligence age, one question that seems to be really at the heart of what we think is to what extent will organizations then be guided by values and principles, which is a quite interesting nuance of the conversation that we are making today. I also would like to continue with the questions from the audience. There's a question from Atanu, and we are unmuting you, Atanu, if you want to ask your question about whether complementarities should be built inside the firm or outside the firm. Atanu, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. Good evening to everyone. Good morning there, I suppose. Carliss, I had one question from your comment that you made in one of the slides that the complementary skill should be more internal. But in the current era, when you're talking about unbundling the organization, you're talking about network organization and build on other capabilities. So how relevant it is to build these complementary capabilities internally? why one should just go back to the internal and not looking at the external capability like strategic alliances and build on others' capability?
Okay, I'll take it. Every company builds its model on a technical system, an underlying technical system that can be decomposed into its components. There are components that are essential, and among the essential components, there are components that are unique. If you have a unique and essential component in your technical system and someone else owns it, you should be, you know, whether you call it a monopoly rent or sharing the surplus or, you know, you are at the mercy of the proprietor. Which you sometimes are, you know, you sometimes have no choice. A lot of you use Windows. I use a Macintosh. You know, there are essential and unique components out there that are essential and unique because they're better. But you should realize, hearken more what they said. You should realize what is going on here. That it's not ideal, and it will lead to hold up. And the holdup in turn will lead to defensive investment as you try to protect yourself from the depredations of the unique and owner of the unique and essential component. So that's the sense in which you may choose to outsource. Many of us haven't much of a choice there. But I was really focusing on the digital exchange platforms, which is quite a narrow band. It's the one, it is the leading force in AI, but it's a very small percent. It's a large percent of stock market value, a small percent of all firms in the universe. I think if you want to play in that arena, you better own those algorithms, and you better be able to tweak those algorithms, which if you outsource them, they become a black box, and all you can deal with is the APIs that the owners give you. So that's the sense in which for that narrow set of firms, I think those strong complements need to be in-source.
Thank you, Carliss. And we have a question from Sham that pushes us to go back to the role of, to basically the sources of competitive advantage in a world dominated by artificial intelligence. Sham, over to you to ask your question.
Sure. Hi, Elena. Hi to all the panelists out there. You know, my question is basically based on what you know, everything one hears about. One view is, in this world, algorithms and algorithm development is not going to be the source of competitive advantage. Parallel to that, you hear a view which says, you know, access to data is going to be the main source. You know, data is the new oil, and so on and so forth. Then, of course, in all this conversation, you don't hear mention of judgment. So just as a thought experiment, if you took two organizations, both of which are doing prediction, let's say radiologists, what types of organizations are likely to win and get ahead, and where are, you know, the critical sources of competitive advantage likely to be, if we were to think about that? So
I'm happy to take a shot at that.
Great.
Sure. So Sham, I think that who will win and who should win are two different questions. I think based on my assessment, I would say that the critical component here are going to be data, because without the data, you cannot exercise the judgment and you cannot exercise the algorithms, right? So in a sense, there is a hierarchy towards, or a precedence relationship here. So you need to have the data, whether you own it or you don't. The problem is that once the data are too highly concentrated, you have a winner-take-all kind of equilibrium possible very easily. Which means, and that may not be in our own interests as a society or as individuals. So in that sense, you can have judgment that is terrible for humanity, but wonderful for the company, and you could still win, which is why I believe that there is another component here, which kind of was touched upon by, Avi and Carliss earlier also, which is we can rely upon values up to a point, but we also need legislation, which will make sure that if, that we have ways of sharing those data, because they could become essentially what we would call, what we would call an essential service in some respects, extending that kind of picture. So I think there is what you're drawing attention to is the need for new sort of antitrust type litigation or legislation, which will enable the real oil to be split. Notice that the actual oil has always created enough misery in the world. We don't want to replace it with a new source of misery. And therefore, it's very important that we legislate as of now how these data are going to be owned and how they can be used.
I think Avi was.
Yeah, Avi?
Wait, a little bit. So I don't see why we have to choose, frankly. I think we can have competitive advantage from data, competitive advantage from algorithms, good judgment, and different firms are going to win in different ways. That said, to win in data requires regulatory barriers. Data is non-rival, right? If I have data and I share it with you, we both have it. And so for it really to be about data, it has to be about unique data, and there has to be effectively some restriction on collecting it. So regulation, privacy regulation, this is sort of my thing in particular, is a driver of competitive advantage in data. And we've seen that in GDPR, that so far the privacy regulation seems to have led to increasing competition, increasing concentration. So my take is, I don't see why we have to choose, but if it's going to be data, there's a regulatory complement to that. And antitrust and privacy laws work in opposite. So, Gautam suggested antitrust. In some sense, we could add antitrust to deal with the fact that we have privacy regulations that lead to concentration, and then another layer of regulations that try to disentangle it. That's going to be, that might be the right regulatory solution, but it's sort of, it's a little bit of whack-a-mole in some sense.
Yes.
I want to take it in a little, I want to come back again and focus on these digital exchange platforms that are probably at the heart of many of the conflicts and violations. They actually, as compared to product platforms, have very low switching costs. They cannot impose switching costs on their primary users because they want you to have a very easy time getting on the platform and doing your thing, doing your transaction or sending your message. So in order to lock people in, they have to do other things. They do two things. The first is they create APIs and essentially encourage complementors to build the code they own into their algorithms. So Google does this with all of their ad stuff. If you look at the distribution of who besides the big operating systems companies has APIs, it's all the exchange platforms. They're all encouraging the creation of dependent code. But the other thing they do, and they all are now doing it, is they're giving you free data storage. Because data isn't quite as sticky as APIs, but you don't really want to move it very, it's hard to move and they don't make it easy. So I'm with the people who say we need legislation. I think there was an act proposed in the Senate of the United States in maybe October and there has been a joint project to make data more mobile, but it all died. So far, I think at this point in time, for good and sufficient reasons, there's no action on this front that I can tell.
Thank you. We have a question from Kostas Markides, who unfortunately had to leave at very sharply at 5, but he's a great friend of the knowledge and innovation community. So it's what we like about this question is that it brings together the human aspect and the more and the issue about competitive advantage that started this conversation today. So his question is, it is humans that develop the algorithms and it is humans that interpret the predictions of the machines. So does this mean that it is the quality of these humans that create the competitive advantage of the firm?
I typed out my answer because I thought we were out of time, so I'll let someone else answer.
Carliss?
I think without doubt, but the humans are frail and biased as well. What do you call it? The heroes, the masters of the new universe come from a very small and highly selected group of humans who have their own views of the world. Not a particularly diverse group, not representative of that. They have very much, I think, values in their own culture that reflect their own experiences and talents. Anyway, so yes, and there are huge differences amongst humans in their talent in things that this new world rewards. So I'll stop.
Gautam?
I think that I completely agree with Carliss, but I will add one more layer to that, which is that let's not forget that there is a temporal order in the world. You can have a very smart human who puts together an incredible algorithm, but let's also imagine that 5 years down the line, there's a much, much smarter human. Unfortunately, what could happen, and has happened in the history of the world time and again, is that the earlier moving, individual or set of individuals can use their advantage to essentially restrict or construct a new system which limits the possibilities of others coming after them. So we know in economics, we call it the notion of entry barriers, but even in pure mechanics, which is what we would think of as things, the first human that came up with the idea of building a cannon was, smart. But the point is, once the cannon got built and it knocked down everybody else around, it took a long time for another, sort of innovation to come through and make up. So the smartest of people may not get an opportunity to do that, which is why I kind of return to the notion that both privacy laws as well as regulatory restraints are required if we want Costa's world to be the one that's wise. Because otherwise, the small group of people that Carliss referred to can actually impose their value systems on everybody else, and the endowment effect will be sufficient to, or could be sufficient in cases to really lead to disruption.
Avi, unfortunately, our attendees cannot read your answers in the Q&A section, so I would invite you to give your answers.
Okay, so I just said, great question. Judgment's a source of competitive advantage. So it's effectively the same thing, a different version of what Carliss and Gautam just said. Judgment's a source of competitive advantage. Knowing which predictions to make and what to do with them when you have them is a key skill. And if your organization excels in that skill, that's a good opportunity for competitive advantage.
Will ever machines be, building upon your suggestion that judgment remains a core competitive advantage of humans, will machine ever get to be able to basically perform judgment as well?
So ever is a long time, so probably, but that has very little to do with technology we're talking about now. That said, what you can get is machines that learn to predict judgment. And so what you can do is you're essentially moving the judgment up a layer, where it's now a human figuring out the reward function on what is to tell a machine to predict what the human would do. to predict what other humans would do. So it's still a human doing judgment, but you've kind of moved the judgment up a layer and now the human has told the machine, predict what other humans would do in this situation. And that's a way to generate machines that predict judgment.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we are getting close to the end of this talk. What I find fascinating is that we started from a question on competitive advantage, and we ended up talking about the regulations that we would expect in the world where artificial intelligence dominates. We talked about values, we talked about humans and machines. So this was a fantastic talk. So I would like really to thank, on the behalf of the knowledge and innovation community, our three panelists for being with us today, and I'm hopeful that we will continue these conversations offline and hopefully in other events of the knowledge and innovation community. So in the old world, we would conclude with a round of applause for our panelists, which unfortunately the current technology is not yet able to very effectively replicate. But please use the chat to express your appreciation for the speakers. I would like to thank you, members of the knowledge and innovation communities, for attending this session today. And I hope to see you soon at the SMS virtual conference in October, if not sooner. Thank you very much.